Somebody said, it was either Da Vinci or Warren Beatty, that works of art are not finished, they're just abandoned. And you could stay playing with all these things forever. Does seem to be a time where you have to walk away. Am I totally satisfied with the screenplay? Am I totally satisfied with the movie? No. But I am reconciled to the fact that they work pretty damn well and a lot of people love this movie. I'm not going to sit there and argue that they're wrong. That's ridiculous. I must have started reading Sherlock Holmes when I was about 10 years old. And I suppose my father showed them to me. He may have even read some aloud to me when I was very young. He did read to me Kipling, the Just So stories. But then, of course, I was off and running reading them myself. There are 56 short stories and 4 Holmes novellas. And there's a very famous cartoon of a small boy sitting in bed reading The Final Problem with a look of complete dismay on his face. And I think that small boy is not alone. I think a lot of kids reading Sherlock Holmes feel bereft when they come to the end of the stories. Hence the idea that must have occurred to other people before me of writing some more adventures of their own. I had wondered about doing my own Sherlock Holmes something from the time I was a kid. As I said, when you run out of stories, what do you do? When I was in high school, kids would say to me, "Oh, your old man's a shrink. Is he a Freudian?" And I didn't know. I wasn't in therapy with him. How would I know? So I said to my father, I said, "Pop, are you a Freudian?" And he said, "It's a silly question." And I said, "Why? Why is it a silly question?" He said, "Because it's no more possible to discuss the origins of psychoanalysis without starting with Freud than it is to discuss the discovery of America without starting with Columbus or the Vikings, if you want to get cute. But to suppose that nothing has happened since the Vikings, that's to be pretty rigid, pretty doctrinaire." When a patient comes to see me, I listen to what they say. I listen to how they say it. I'm especially interested in what they don't say. I'm curious about their body language, how they sit, how they comport themselves, what kind of clothes they're wearing. Are they on time for the appointment? I am, in short, searching for clues from them as to why they are not happy. And I suddenly realized who Sherlock Holmes reminded me of all this time. Reminded me of my dad. And so then I found myself wondering how much Arthur Conan Doyle knew about the life and writing of Sigmund Freud. I had all of that rattling around my head for a very long time. Meanwhile, I came out to California to break into the movie business and make movies, and I was sort of doing okay as a screenwriter with television movies. And then the Writers Guild went on strike. And the woman with whom I was cohabiting at the time said, "Well, you're not allowed to write screenplays now, but you could do that book you keep talking about. You know, Sherlock meets Sigmund." And aside from picketing every day outside the Goldwyn Studios for 3 hours, I had nothing to do. So I sat down and wrote it, and it never really occurred to me that it was going to be any kind of succès fou. I just thought it was publishable when it was finished, and no one was more astonished than I was when it shot to the top of the bestseller lists and stayed there for 40 weeks. And suddenly I, was famous. It was very bizarre. And the lesson I learned is, only do the things that you like and never mind what you think someone else will like. And when they wanted to make it into a movie, which was shortly thereafter, I said, well, you can make it into a movie, but I have to write the script. And they said, okay. And then the script got nominated for an Oscar, and suddenly I was part of the establishment, for better or worse. The only person involved in the process beside me was the director, Herb Ross, in the process of adapting the book. And there were two things that I think are sort of worth remarking on. One is, from my point of view, I thought, what's the real problem with adapting a famous mystery story into a movie is that everybody already knows the ending or the gimmick or the whatever. When you saw Scott Turo's Presumed Innocent, when we read the book, it was a big surprise when we learned who'd done it. But after months on the bestseller list, the movie comes out with Harrison Ford, and we know who'd done it. And so it's not going to be a surprise. And I thought, okay, if I'm getting to do this again, then I'm going to change the mystery so that people just can't relax in the second half of the movie once Holmes meets Freud and know what's coming. It's got to be different. And I had no particular loyalty or reverence for what I had written. Which is interesting because my director, Herb Ross, he was overflowing with an insistence that nothing that people loved be left out. Case in point, the tennis match, my dreams addition to the novel, which I said, no, we can't have a tennis match in the middle of this movie. It's got nothing to do with anything, and the whole movie is going to slow down to a stop while two people play tennis. And Herb says, but everybody loves that scene. It's, can't you make it pay off at the end? Well, we did, and he, I guess, was right because the scene plays in the movie. But a lot of times, when I tried to, it was very curious. Usually you think of the writer as sort of insisting that things go in, and the director insisting that things come out. And we were completely reversed. I kept trying to get him to remove words, to shorten speeches, to make things more cinematic and less talky. And he kept saying, oh, you're deballing your own script. He didn't say castrating, he said, you're deballing your own script. And there was a moment at the end when Freud makes a big speech at the end, after he hypnotizes Holmes one last time. And he sums up everything. And Watson looks at him and says, you're the greatest detective of them all. And I said to Herb, cut the speech. And he said, what? And I said, cut the speech. Look what Alan Arkin's doing with his hands. He goes like this. It becomes clear. Cut. You're the greatest detective of them all. We don't need a laundry list of what we've all just learned. No, he wouldn't do it. And I still dream at night of going in with the scissors and just snapping out some more voids. I was present during most of the shooting of the movie, which is not always typical, but I really wanted to watch because I knew I wanted to direct. So it was a learning experience. I think Herb wanted me there in case we needed any dialogue adjustments. Victorian speech is not something that you could just sort of ad lib, and we wanted to make sure that, every sentence had the proper locution, and if you needed another line to get an actor across a room or something, I would be there. And for me, it was all like having a dream come true. It was beyond anything. Since I never thought I was going to amount to anything in my whole life, the idea that I'd actually written this best-selling novel and was now going to be a movie. And I grew up, and one of my idols was Laurence Olivier, Sir Laurence Olivier, Lord Olivier. And this was the guy who had, without, of course, his ever knowing it, introduced me to the great love of my life, William Shakespeare and his plays. And I used to sit and watch Henry V and Richard III like a gazillion times. And funnily enough, I had seen, I guess, his movie of the Three Sisters, and I suddenly understood Chekhov for the first time. And I wrote to him. I said, oh, you got to write, because one of you will die and the other one will be real sad that he never said anything. So I wrote him a letter telling him how much I loved the movie and his other movies and how much this had all meant to me. And at the end of it, I said, I'm trying to be a writer and I'm working on this book and I think it's going to be published. And if you'd like, I will send it to you. And I quoted from The Taming of the Shrew, too little payment for so great a debt. And he wrote me back a very nice framed letter, which I framed right away, saying, oh, I'm so glad you like the book. You know, it was like he wasn't really paying any attention, but it meant everything to me. Now, I'm actually sitting there on the set at Pinewood, and I said, you know, I wrote you a letter, I don't know if you remember, after I saw the Three Sisters movie, and you wrote me a very nice answer. And in the letter, I said I was trying to be a writer. And and I offered to send you a copy of the book, and he didn't remember any of that. He didn't remember a thing. And I said, well, would you like a copy now? And so what was he going to say? He said, of course, dear boy. He'll call me dear boy because he couldn't remember my name. And he said to me, he said, did he really take cocaine? I said, yes, he did. He said, oh, I don't think my father let me read that one. The casting, Herb Ross made me a part of making this movie from the very beginning. I was there in his office every day, and we were fooling around with different ideas. And I remember my first idea was Peter O'Toole for Holmes, and Herb had made a movie with him, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and they had not parted on good terms or worked on good terms, so that was out. He called me up, he said, what do you think of Nicol Williamson, and whose Hamlet I had just seen on Broadway? Yes. Now, one thing that I think is not entirely understood, and certainly wasn't understood, for example, by the publicists at Universal at the time it came to advertise the movie, is the 7% Solution is not a Sherlock Holmes movie. It's a movie about Sherlock Holmes. That's different. A Sherlock Holmes movie implies a sort of genre, generic, you know, usual sort of stuff. This is a movie about the inside of this man's character and how he got to be who and what he is. So you're not meeting Holmes in a normal, you know, high-functioning operational mode. You're meeting Holmes in terrible, terrible personal problem. He needs help. That's the story, not the story of him helping somebody else. And the performance that Nicol Williamson gave, I thought, totally nailed that particular Sherlock Holmes. What he would have been like if he had been doing one of the stories, I have no way of knowing or telling. I cast Alan Arkin as Sigmund Freud, and I thought he was a wonderful Freud, intelligent and sympathetic. It's very interesting. I think actors, they're among the many divisions that you can make in actors. What's the difference between an actor and a movie star? An actor is somebody who pretends to be somebody else. A movie star is somebody who pretends that somebody else is them. That's one kind of distinction. Another kind of distinction is there are actors whom you can see thinking, whom you can see feeling. And then there are actors who are complete, don't let anything in. And Alan Arkin is an actor where you can see the wheels going around. And I thought that was very important. Not just the intellectual wheels, but also the emotional wheels. And I thought this was crucial, that you could see that kind of activity behind the eyes. And also somebody who was sympathetic. And I thought he gave a great performance. The story of Watson and how we cast Robert Duvall began with our revolt against Nigel Bruce, and Watson always being portrayed as Colonel Blimp and being a buffoon. And I said, no, the whole point of this movie is to get people, and the book too, was to get people to look at these characters fresh and see them as if for the first time, and not in their stereotypical sort of outfits and mannerisms and the way Hollywood had sort of oversimplified them. So when we heard that Robert Duvall was interested in playing Watson, I was thrilled. I was over the moon, because I said, here's a great actor and he wants to play this role. And I thought, this is really great. And he never played him as an idiot. He played him as a stout army guy who was very devoted to his friend. Funnily enough, I think there are many good things about the screenplay for the 7% Solution, but it is much talkier. I became a better screenwriter. I could get the same effect far more cinematically after I'd started directing. Somebody said, will you ever write another Sherlock Holmes adventure? And my answer is relatively simple. If I get an idea that seems to really fit Holmes, I might. And I've had one for a while, which is like 3 years or something, that's been sort of dancing around my head, that I thought might make an interesting Holmes story. I just really haven't had time, or to be candid, the bank balance to give me time to sit down and work it out. But if I did, I might give this other one a shot.